The insult came without warning, slicing through the dinner table like something sharp. "Looks like something scraped off a cafeteria tray," Marcy said loudly, her voice carrying enough venom to make every chair go still. She leaned back as if she'd accomplished something clever, her smirk widening when Ethan stiffened in his seat. His mother, Mrs. Dalton, looked down at her hands, wishing she could disappear. Across the table, Grace shrank into herself, while little Ellie blinked rapidly to fight back tears. Nora, who had spent years cushioning this family from Marcy's drama, felt her heart thud painfully. But her expression stayed calm. She lifted her glass slowly, letting the silence wrap tightly around Marcy like a rope. When Marcy looked certain she had won, Nora said softly, "I didn't cook tonight, but someone you know did." Before I continue, kindly hit the subscribe button, like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. Marcy scoffed, not even noticing how her daughters' faces fell. But Nora noticed everything: the shrinking shoulders, the forced stillness. That night became the moment the quiet unraveling began, even though none of them understood it yet. It was simply the first time Nora didn't swallow the hurt. From the outside, Nora's family looked like a postcard. Two houses standing side by side on a quiet Portland street, children running between yards, dinners shared often enough to feel like a tradition. Nora used to believe in that picture. She created warm spaces for a living, designing homes that felt safe and inviting. Strangely, she could do it perfectly for strangers. Yet inside her extended family, she constantly stitched warmth together by hand, as if the seams might fall apart at any moment. Ethan, steady and patient, tried to hold everyone together. Mrs. Dalton, gentle but aging, leaned on them quietly, grateful for Nora's help even when she didn't ask for it directly. And then there was Marcy, the unpredictable storm in human form, arriving with dramatic entrances and treating every family gathering like a stage crafted for her spotlight. Where others brought gratitude, she brought demands. Where others found comfort, she stirred tension. It wasn't always like this. Years earlier, Nora and Ethan moved next door to Mrs. Dalton believing it would be a blessing, close enough to help, far enough to breathe. But over time, the illusion of harmony began to dissolve. The truth was still hidden, but the cracks were already forming beneath the surface. When Marcy visited, she never came quietly. She arrived with her 4 children, Grace, Ellie, and her 2 older boys, and immediately detached from responsibility. She would drift toward the couch, scrolling on her phone, disappearing at unpredictable moments while her children spilled into Nora's home with restless energy. At first, Nora didn't mind. She loved children, and her sons adored their cousins. Grace and Ellie clung to her with a gentle familiarity, seeking comfort without saying a word. Nora found herself softening her voice for them, offering steady reassurance for reasons she didn't fully understand. She didn't question why they seemed more at ease with her than with their own mother, she simply extended more of herself. But small routines became patterns, and patterns hardened into expectations. Nora became the default caretaker whenever noise rose or a meal was needed. She cleaned up messes she didn't create and calmed children she didn't frustrate. And Marcy assumed this was natural, as though Nora existed to absorb the overflow of her life. Nora told herself it wasn't a burden. She preferred harmony over confrontation. But harmony began to cost her something, little pieces of strength, time, and quiet, until the weight of unspoken responsibility settled like dust across her days. Over time, the imbalance grew sharper. If the children argued, they were sent to Nora. If dinner was needed, Nora was expected to cook. If the girls cried, they ran to Nora's door, not their mother's. Marcy rarely acknowledged the effort. Instead, she breezed through gatherings, dismissing Nora's contributions and rolling her eyes whenever anyone suggested she step in. The children absorbed every tone, every sigh, every disregard. The dinner insult, the cafeteria remark thrown carelessly across the table, not only belittled the meal but also crushed Grace and Ellie, who had worked alongside Nora that night, rinsing vegetables and stirring broth with quiet pride. Nora remembered Ellie's shoulders folding inward, Grace holding her breath, and Marcy obliviously smirking, unaware that she had stepped on her daughters' hearts. That moment changed something in Nora. It wasn't loud, it was a quiet shifting, like a thread loosening beneath fabric. She began to see the girls' small hesitations, their constant effort not to upset Marcy, their instinct to seek Nora for stability. Marcy's carelessness was no longer harmless. It was shaping the children in ways they couldn't yet name. And Nora realized she could no longer look away from the harm being done in plain sight. After that night, the air between the two houses shifted subtly. Marcy pretended nothing had happened, navigating her mother's home with the same entitlement as always. But the children felt the difference. They lingered near Nora more often, hovering close to her calm presence. The boys sought loud distractions. The girls sought quiet comfort. Even Ethan noticed the widening gap, his glances speaking questions he didn't voice. Mrs. Dalton sensed the tension too, though she tried to smooth things over, unwilling to confront her daughter's growing carelessness. Nora felt torn, still wanting to maintain peace, but no longer willing to be swallowed by someone else's chaos. Distance became impossible. Children gravitate toward safety, and the girls found safety in Nora's steady rhythm. One afternoon, Ellie whispered a truth she shouldn't have had words for. She never thinks about how we feel. It settled heavily in Nora's chest. The patterns were no longer patterns, they were symptoms. And symptoms, when ignored, only deepen. Nora knew something had begun unraveling quietly, inch by inch. She just didn't know yet how far it would go. A few days later, Nora stepped onto her back porch and found Ellie sitting alone on the steps, tracing circles in the dust with her shoe. The little girl didn't look up when Nora opened the door. She simply whispered, "Do you think Mom was mad at us that night?" The question cut through Nora with painful clarity. She sat beside Ellie and gently explained that the cruel remark wasn't about her or Grace. It was about Marcy's inability to consider feelings outside her own. Ellie blinked quickly, fighting back tears as she murmured, "She never does." The truth in her voice, the weary acceptance, felt far too heavy for a child her age. That evening, Nora told Ethan what Ellie had said. He rubbed his forehead as if trying to erase years of misplaced loyalty to his sister. "It's getting worse," he muttered. "She doesn't even see the damage she causes." Nora nodded quietly. She had been avoiding this reality for too long. The dinner insult had exposed the surface, but moments like this revealed the depth. The girls weren't just hurt, they were being shaped by their mother's dismissiveness. And Nora knew instinctively that her role in their lives was shifting into something more protective, more deliberate. The final push came at school pickup. Ellie pulled away from her mother and walked directly to Nora, clinging to her sleeve with trembling fingers. Marcy didn't notice. She was too busy arguing loudly on her phone, pacing in frustrated circles. Ellie whispered, "Can we come to your house tonight? I don't want to mess anything up again." That single word, again, stung Nora deeply. Children shouldn't believe their existence is a mistake waiting to happen. Nora hugged her gently and assured her she hadn't done anything wrong. Later that evening, Ethan found Nora sitting at the dining table with a notebook open before her. She had began documenting, not out of spite, but because she needed clarity. The missed pickups, the late returns, the nights the girls sought refuge at her home. "Are you planning something?" Ethan asked carefully. Nora shook her head. "No. I'm preparing." She didn't know exactly for what, but something told her the situation was becoming too unstable to ignore. The girls needed consistency, and Marcy was offering anything except that. One morning, Grace and Ellie were at Nora's house. They sat in the living room with Nora's boys, coloring and talking in soft voices. But the peace didn't last long. A knock came at the door, soft but urgent. When Nora opened it, the girl's father stood there with a tired expression. "The hearing got moved up," he said. "I have to take them now." Ellie's face fell. Grace clutched her backpack. Nora knelt, kissed their foreheads, and whispered, "You'll be okay. I'm right here." The girls nodded, though their eyes glistened. Nora watched from the doorway as their father led them to his car, her heart heavy with worry she couldn't voice. She had no control over what would happen next. All she could do was wait, and hope the girls didn't have to carry more pain than they already had. Hours later, Nora heard a car door slam next door. She stepped outside and saw Marcy walking toward Mrs. Dalton's house, her face pale, her movements stiff, her eyes empty. Nora didn't approach her. She stayed on her porch, feeling the tension gather like a storm cloud. Minutes later, Nora's phone buzzed. "Please come," Mrs. Dalton whispered over the phone. "If you're still watching, kindly hit the subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from." Nora walked next door. Inside, Marcy stood by the window, rigid, shaking. Mrs. Dalton sat on the couch clutching a tissue. Marcy finally spoke. "The judge gave him full custody." Her voice cracked. "I was in the courtroom. I stood there and watched them choose him. They told the judge they feel safer with him. They wouldn't even look at me." Her voice crumbled. Nora stayed still. Marcy suddenly spun toward Nora, her face twisted with hurt and fury.
"Is this what you wanted?" she shouted.
You're always there, always stepping in, always acting like you know my children better than I do. Mrs. Dalton tried to speak, but Marcy cut her off, her pain transforming into accusation.
"They prefer you. You must be so happy now.
Maybe you'd like to raise them yourself."
Nora didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back.
She simply stood still, letting the words settle. Something inside her shifted, a calm, unshakable clarity rising in her chest.
"I never tried to replace you," Nora said quietly.
"I just made sure they felt safe," her tone firm but controlled. "You lost them because they were scared of disappointing you, not because of me." Marcy's anger faltered, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know how to respond. The room grew unbearably still, the truth settling between them like a boundary Nora should have drawn long ago. Marcy sank onto the arm of the couch, her expression cracking beneath the truth. "I didn't mean to hurt them," she whispered. I thought they knew I loved them." "Loved?" Nora's voice controlled. "Do you remember that dinner, the night you said the food looked like something scraped off a cafeteria tray?" Marcy froze, her eyes widening as if the memory had only now resurfaced. Nora continued, her tone steady. "They made that dinner for you," she said. Grace and Ellie rinsed the vegetables. They stirred the pot. They laughed every time the broth splashed. Marcy's lip trembled, tears gathering. "They were proud," Nora added. "And your words crushed them in front of everyone. You mocked the meal without turning around. You didn't look at their faces. You didn't ask who cooked it. And you crushed their pride before they could hand you the plate." Mrs. Dalton pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Marcy opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Her hands shook. The weight of her actions she had never paused to examine, pressed heavily against her. I didn't know," she whispered, but the words faltered. Nora remained steady. "They told me later they thought they embarrassed you. They thought they ruined everything." "Why didn't you tell me?" Marcy whispered finally, her voice small. Nora exhaled. "I tried. Many times. But you never listened. Not to me, not to them." Mrs. Dalton silently wiped tears from her cheeks. The weight of generational patterns, long ignored and led in silence, hung in the air. Marcy shook her head helplessly. "I was overwhelmed. I was stressed. You don't know everything I was juggling." Nora nodded. "That might be true. But I know what your daughters were juggling: fear, uncertainty, and the belief that love had to be earned." Those words struck deeper than any argument could. Marcy pressed her hands against her face, her shoulders trembling. "I've lost everything," she whispered. But Nora shook her head. "Not everything. But you have consequences you can't avoid." Marcy looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "Can I fix it?" she asked, her voice cracking. Nora held her gaze. "You can start over. You can become the mother they want to come back to. But you have to do the work, not expect them to carry the pain." Mrs. Dalton placed a gentle hand on Marcy's shoulder, but Marcy barely reacted, overwhelmed by the realization of how her neglect had shaped her daughters' hearts. Mrs. Dalton cleared her throat softly. "Honey, there is something I need to tell you." Marcy looked up slowly, wary. Mrs. Dalton paused, then said quietly, "I'm selling the house. I can't manage it anymore. And I'll be moving in with Nora and Ethan." Marcy went completely still, the shock hitting her before she could brace herself. Her brows tightened, her mouth parted, and her eyes widened in helpless disbelief. It wasn't anger, just raw fear and humiliation as she realized her mother was choosing stability somewhere she wasn't included. Her jaw trembled, the confidence she always wore slipping away in an instant. Weeks later, the real estate agent had arranged everything quickly. Boxes were carried out of Mrs. Dalton's old home as she signed the final documents. Nora stood beside her, offering quiet support. The house that once held so much chaos now stood empty, its walls relieved of the weight they had carried for years. Ethan helped organize the last-minute details, while Mrs. Dalton supervised with a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Marcy stayed inside the house, overwhelmed by the speed of change. She didn't step outside while strangers disassembled the life she once took for granted. Nora respected the space, knowing Marcy needed to face her reality alone. That evening, Mrs. Dalton moved into the small extension built off Nora's home, a cozy space already prepared with fresh bedding, warm lighting, and the quiet assurance that she was welcomed. Grace and Ellie visited that night, curling into Mrs. Dalton with the ease of children who finally had stability. Nora watched them, feeling gratitude for a peace that had been hard-earned. The transition wasn't merely physical, it was emotional healing falling into place one piece at a time. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different. Without Marcy's erratic energy or sudden demands, the atmosphere softened. Nora settled into a gentle rhythm with her family and Mrs. Dalton. The extension became a warm refuge where the older woman read stories to the children and shared quiet conversations with Nora. Ethan often remarked, "It finally feels calm," and Nora couldn't disagree. Across the yard, Mrs. Dalton's former house sat empty and quiet, its silence no longer threatening but simply still. Marcy had moved out after the sale was finalized, staying temporarily in a small apartment across town. She texted her mother occasional updates, mostly practical, never emotional. Nora didn't hear from her, and she didn't expect to. Boundaries had been drawn, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Meanwhile, Grace and Ellie continued visiting with their father. Each visit brought more laughter, more relaxed shoulders, more conversations that didn't require walking on emotional eggshells. Nora observed the subtle transformation with quiet pride. Healing had begun, not dramatically, but steadily, like dawn easing into morning. One weekend, Grace and Ellie arrived carrying small backpacks and bright smiles. Their father walked them up to Nora's porch, thanked her for being a stable presence, and promised to return in the evening. As soon as the girls entered, they relaxed visibly. They helped Nora prepare lunch, chopping vegetables with practiced hands. Mrs. Dalton joined them, humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove. It was an ordinary afternoon. But for the girls, ordinary meant peaceful, something they hadn't always known. Later, they played outside with Nora's sons, laughter drifting across the yard. Mrs. Dalton sat on a lawn chair under the shade, watching them with a soft, relieved smile. "They are changing," she whispered to Nora. "You can see it in the way they move." Nora nodded. Trauma leaves its mark, but safety can unmark it slowly. Grace called out for her to come join their game, and Nora did, grateful for the simple joy in the air. These weren't children weighed down by fear, they were growing into themselves again. That evening, after the sun dipped behind the trees, Ellie approached Nora quietly. "Auntie Nora," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nora knelt to meet her gaze. Ellie hesitated, then said, "Thank you, for not giving up on us." Grace, standing behind her, nodded with soft eyes. Nora's heart tightened with emotion. "You deserve to feel safe," she said gently. "Always." Ellie hugged her tightly, holding on for longer than she normally would. Ethan watched from the porch, his expression warm and contemplative. Later, he told Nora, "They trust you. It's more than comfort, it's safety." Nora didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about how small acts of kindness had brought them to this moment, listening, cooking together, offering space without conditions. These were the seeds of trust the girls had clung to when everything else felt unstable. And now, those seeds were finally blooming. Nora realized that what she had offered wasn't a replacement for their mother, it was a stability Marcy had not yet learned to give. The next morning, Nora's phone buzzed while she set out breakfast. It was a message from Marcy, short, shaky, unexpected. "Can you come?" "Please." Nora paused mid-step. Mrs. Dalton, sitting at the table with her tea, glanced up with concern. "Maybe you should go," she said gently. Nora nodded, slipped on her shoes, and walked out into the cool air. The temporary apartment Marcy had moved into was small. Nora knocked gently, and Marcy opened the door almost immediately, her eyes red and exhausted. "I talked to their father," she said as soon as Nora stepped inside. Her voice was raw, stripped of bravado. She led Nora to the small living room and sank onto the couch. "I asked if I could see the girls this weekend. He said they aren't ready." Tears welled in her eyes. They need more time." Nora remained quiet, letting her speak. "He said they'll see me when they are ready, not when I demand it." Marcy's voice cracked. She looked up at Nora with desperation. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" Nora sat across from her, calm but firm. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for like a favor," she said gently. "It's something you earn." Marcy wiped her face with her sleeve, overwhelmed. "I messed up," she whispered. "I didn't see what I was doing." Nora nodded. "You didn't. But now you can choose differently." Marcy folded her hands tightly, absorbing the truth. "I want to try," she said quietly. Nora regarded her for a moment, recognizing a sincerity she hadn't seen before. Then start by working on yourself, not on them. If you change, they'll feel it. For the first time, Marcy didn't argue, deflect, or blame. She simply nodded, accepting responsibility in a way she never had. Nora stood to leave. Before she reached the door, Marcy whispered, "Thank you, for being honest. I needed it." Nora didn't respond. She stepped out into the cool air with a strange sense of closure. Not satisfaction, just understanding. Marcy wasn't her responsibility. The children's safety was. And now, the path forward belonged to Marcy alone. 2 days later, Grace and Ellie arrived for their weekend visit, carrying small tote bags filled with books and games. Their father walked them inside and greeted Mrs. Dalton warmly before heading out. The girls settled naturally into the rhythm of Nora's home, and chatting with Mrs. Dalton about school. After dinner, they sat on the porch drinking hot cocoa, the soft glow from the house spilling into the yard. Nora stepped outside quietly, observing them. Their laughter was gentle, unforced, a sign of how far they had come. Ethan joined them on the porch, handing out blankets as the air cooled. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the kitchen as Mrs. Dalton prepared breakfast with the girls at her side. Nora watched them with a soft smile. Ellie cracked eggs carefully, avoiding the messes she once feared making. Grace stirred batter with confidence, not glancing over her shoulder for criticism. Their father arrived mid-morning, thanking Nora for her kindness. "They love being here," he said quietly. "It feels safe." Nora nodded, humbled by the truth in his voice. After he left with the girls, Nora and Ethan spent the afternoon tending to their garden. Mrs. Dalton joined them later, sitting on a small bench with a cup of tea. "You've given them something steady," she said gently. "Something they needed." Nora placed a hand on her shoulder. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "It took all of us." Mrs. Dalton smiled softly. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like a place where new beginnings could flourish. That evening, Nora stepped onto her porch and watched the sunset settle over the empty house next door. It stood quiet now, no longer echoing with tension or unspoken expectations. The emptiness wasn't sad, it was peaceful. It felt like a boundary finally honored. Inside, Mrs. Dalton tucked the children into bed, her voice soft and soothing. Nora listened to the distant hum of her lullaby and felt something warm settle inside her. Nothing about the journey had been simple, but the outcome felt earned. Grace and Ellie were healing. Mrs. Dalton was safe and supported. Their father was steady. And Marcy, well, Marcy was beginning the slow, difficult path of confronting herself. Nora didn't wish her harm. She simply wished her growth. For the first time, the neighborhood felt aligned, not perfect, but grounded. Ethan stood behind Nora, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We made it through," he whispered. Nora leaned into him. "We did," she said softly. Remember to tell me where you're watching from, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs it.